Politics Live now on BBC Two with Jo Coburn.
Today, Boris Johnson takes centre stage in Parliament. He'll be grilled by MPs over whether he was honest about Partygate. And he's set to vote against Rishi Sunak's new Brexit deal for Northern Ireland. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Andrea Leadsom, Labour MP Sarah Champion, the Deputy Political Editor of The Guardian, Jess Elgott, and The Spectator's Political Editor, Katy Balls. Today, Boris Johnson will give a robust defence of what he said in Parliament about lockdown-breaking gatherings.
I'm sure that whatever happened, the guidance was followed and the rules were followed at all times.
But that's not all. Boris Johnson and Liz Truss are set to vote against Rishi Sunak's new Brexit deal for Northern Ireland.
He's got a choice. He can be remembered for the great acts of statecraft that he achieved, or he can risk looking like a pound-shop Nigel Farage.
Also, we'll have Prime Minister's questions at noon. We'll bring it to you live. This man and his family have been trying to register with an NHS dentist for 3 years. Why is it so difficult? And shortages of salad and vegetables have led to a surprise rise in inflation. Let's start with that final story you heard there in the headlines. I think we can show you the BBC News story about what's happened in terms of inflation and prices. It's gone up from 10.1% to 10.4%. Veg shortages drive surprise jump in UK inflation. It's supposed to be going down. It's one of Rishi Sunak's key priorities, to halve inflation this year. It's going in the wrong direction, Andrea, and it means prices are again rising more sharply. Cost of living problems then still very much present. How big a problem is this for Rishi Sunak?
Well, it's a huge problem for households and businesses across the country. You know, with inflation not yet peaking and coming down, that is challenging for business confidence and so on. However, I would point to the fact that the Office for Budget Responsibility predicts, and pretty much all economists predict, that inflation will much more than halve by the end of this year. The central forecast is 2.9% by the end of this year, which is good news. But
although
I think what
prices
it does
will
show,
continue to rise, of course, just not at the rate.
But by a much smaller amount, which means that people will get pay rises and so on that will put them in a stronger position by the end of this year. I know that's small compensation, but it is really important not to over-egg 1 month's numbers. You know, the Prime Minister has said he is absolutely targeting getting inflation down, and it's essential that he continues to do that.
I mean, is it that big a deal in the whole scheme of things for families when you think that actually it had come down a bit, it's gone up a bit, it is set to go down to 2.9% by the end of the year?
I mean, today was meant to be Rishi Sunak's big day, and it's unravelled ridiculously fast for him. Yes, it is a really big deal. Anybody that's been to a shop, a supermarket, and tried to buy food knows, A, the price is ridiculous, and B, trying to get quality food is almost impossible. What we need is the government to be addressing those underlying issues rather than just focusing on sort of the quick headlines that they seem to be fighting for.
I mean, Sarah is right. Food prices at their highest rate for 45 years. We've also got a decision on interest rates later, well, tomorrow, in fact. How big a problem is it for Rishi Sunak personally and the government when they've made halving inflation such a key priority?
I think it's a huge deal, not because necessarily that the words inflation mean a huge amount to ordinary people, but because every single time a voter goes into the supermarket and sees that their pack of butter costs £4 or their juice costs £3.50 or they can't get the kind of fruit and veg that they want, it makes people remember that they feel worse off under this government. And I think that that is the thing, that is the key driver ultimately that decides elections. It is almost the biggest reason why people might decide it's time for a change of government. And so that is one of the reasons why Sunak's made it such a priority and Hunt's made it such a priority.
Katy?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons Number 10 currently look at a spring election as something that could be quite appealing, is that if you look at the OBR forecasts on inflation, it would be more than halved, slashed considerably, I think around 1% at that point, which goes to Jess's point about the general feel and the mood in the country when these things happen. I think from today's news, I mean, this is just one small increase. Obviously, people will feel it, but I think we need to see if it's more of a consistent trend to really think that Rishi Sunak's target is not achievable. The general direction has been going in the right way. So I think it is a reminder that these things can go more slowly than expected. But given we just had the OBR forecast, last week with the budget, I think there's still a sense that this will be going in the right direction.
Is it making you nervous, though, Andrea, despite that forecast, and also because we know from the Office for Budget Responsibility, following the budget statement by Jeremy Hunt, that living standards will continue to fall for the next 2 years?
Yeah, so it's not making me nervous politically, but of course it is terrible for consumers and businesses who are trying to make ends meet at the moment. And so what I can say is that as inflation comes down, which it will, because we've seen the wholesale price of energy has dropped dramatically, as those inflationary pressures work their way through, inflation will come down. So I think that the budget forecasts are realistic, they're very carefully assessed, but nevertheless it is a very difficult time for households. There's no doubt about that, and I see that in my constituency caseload, and I'm sure Sarah does too.
All right. It's a big, important day here in Parliament for the government and for Boris Johnson, because there is a political showdown happening this afternoon between the former Prime Minister and a Commons committee of MPs tasked with deciding whether or not Boris Johnson deliberately misled Parliament over parties at Downing Street. Now, that is kicking off at 2 o'clock in one part of the Palace of Westminster, while a debate and crunch vote on the current Prime Minister's new Brexit deal for Northern Ireland to solve the post-Brexit trading issues will be underway in the House of Commons chamber following Prime Minister's questions. Very busy here. Any hopes of uniting the party on that issue have been dashed in the last couple of hours, because Boris Johnson has said he's going to vote against what's known as the Stormont break on any future EU regulation, as is another Prime Minister, former Prime Minister, I should say, Liz Truss. And we think there are about 20 or so rebels, which could be very problematic, particularly for the Prime Minister in terms of his political credibility. Let's just have a look at what Boris Johnson has said. The proposed arrangements would mean either that Northern Ireland remained captured by the EU legal order and was increasingly divergent from the rest of the UK, or they would mean that the whole of the UK was unable properly to diverge and take advantage of Brexit. That is not acceptable. I'll be voting against the proposed arrangements today. Do you agree with Boris Johnson, Andrea?
Well, I certainly agree that it is not as ideal as some in the ERG would like it to be.
European Research Group of Conservative MPs.
However, for my own part, I think at any time over the last 7 years, any Brexiteer, myself included, if offered this arrangement under the Windsor Agreement, we would have absolutely jumped at it. And so I think the issue now has got to be, what does it feel like in Northern Ireland? Does Northern Ireland feel like a proper part of the United Kingdom? It is a precious part of our union.
But the Democratic Unionist Party says not.
Well, no, but polls in Northern Ireland suggest that businesses and households are actually accepting that the Windsor Agreement offers a significant advantage in terms of common tax regimes, the ability to trade, to get goods from the UK, to be able to send parcels, to travel, etc. And let's be clear, Northern Ireland has always been complicated. Since the time of the Troubles, the need to not have a hard border. And actually what the Windsor Agreement does, in my view, is to offer the right balance.
So should Boris Johnson, Liz Truss and other Conservative MPs just swallow their pride, or whatever you want to call it, over this issue and change their mind and vote for it?
That is a matter for them. Every MP has to make their own decision ultimately. But the fact of the matter is that what the Windsor Agreement offers is so markedly improved on the workings of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And let's be clear, all those of us who voted for the Northern Ireland Protocol...
I mean, it may be up to them, but they will be rebelling
Yeah,
against Rishi Sunak and the government.
And
do you think that is a wise thing?
That, again, is a matter of them. No, I don't think it's a wise thing, but it is a matter for them. But I think the key thing is the Northern Ireland Protocol, at the time of signing up to it, everybody who signed up to it did so in good faith, and it hasn't worked as it was meant to do.
Or you ignored all the warnings that were set up for you about a border down the Irish Sea.
The Northern Ireland Protocol should have worked in principle, and unfortunately the EU were determined that it wouldn't work, and what the Windsor Agreement offers is a fresh start.
Labour is going to support the Windsor Framework, but you are going to do it against the wishes of the Democratic Unionist Party and probably most unionists in Northern Ireland. Are you comfortable with that?
No, I'm not comfortable with that.
Right.
And to be honest, Rishi Sunak has created this separation by not having the DUP involved in the negotiations from the start. But you had it right earlier. This vote, I believe, is more about trying to humiliate Rishi Sunak than it is about the people of Northern Ireland. Because the whole way through, Northern Ireland has been forgotten. In all the debates that we had, it wasn't there. And this could have been resolved in a much more all-encompassing way a lot earlier. We've had 3 years to do this. So the fact that they've decided to take this stance now, it's about Rishi Sunak and it's about Boris Johnson trying to be leader again, in my opinion.
Andrea?
Well, I don't think that's right, because, you know, you have the DUP have come out and said they don't support it on the basis that they do not believe that it makes Northern Ireland sufficiently exactly the same as the rest of Great Britain.
But had they been
and I don't think you can
from the
conclude,
start, rather than just expected to nod it through, I think you might have got
well, they're
a
not
better deal.
expected to nod it through. This was
They're
presented some weeks ago, and the DUP was offered enough time and space to consider it carefully. And as I say, there are opinion polls in Northern Ireland that suggest that businesses and households do support it, do see it as a significant improvement.
All right, is it humiliating? Will it be humiliating for Rishi Sunak in terms of his political credibility?
I don't think what we're going to see today will be humiliating. I think it's clearly a blow to Rishi Sunak. I think the biggest blow is the fact the DUP are not backing it.
And that means that power sharing
well,
isn't
it means
restored
well,
for the
it means
moment.
that the road to power sharing is looking longer and narrower than I think as many would like it to be. But I also don't think it's ever going to be something which we thought would happen overnight after this deal. There's lots of reasons, complicated reasons when it comes to power sharing. Protocol being one of them. So I think the biggest blow was the fact that Jeffrey Donaldson, Number 10, had hoped, I think, would abstain on the deal. And you had a situation where they're unanimously voting against. As for the Tory rebellion, let's see what we get to on it. I think Rishi Sunak was warned by many of his supporters that by going into this issue, he was creating an opportunity for an anti-Rishi Sunak vote, which could be capitalised on by his critics. Boris Johnson signalled, not in the chamber, but at a paid gig, that he had issues with the deal. So this isn't a huge surprise that he is now voting against. But why did the government choose to have the vote today? They've chosen to have a vote on the day that they know Boris Johnson is in Parliament. He is not always there. And therefore, they were almost, goading him to say, well, if you're going to criticise it, either abstain or back it, don't back it, but you have to make a choice. And therefore, I think we're seeing a bit of a test of strength on both sides, in the sense, how many people get behind Boris Johnson? Is it going to be an impressive figure? What does a potential future Boris Johnson movement look like? And how many stick by Rishi Sunak? So we'll find out by mid-afternoon who is winning there.
Can I just add there?
Yes.
I honestly do not think that this is some kind of set-up to try and, put up or shut up Boris. I just don't think that that's the case. I think Rishi Sunak has been determined to restore the union. I mean, I'm a very proud unionist. I'm sure we all are here.
Yes.
And actually, this has been an unresolved, terrible issue for quality of life and the ability to trade and feel like part of the United Kingdom in Northern Ireland. And so I think Rishi Sunak is absolutely determined to fix that problem.
I think that is the guiding reason they have renegotiated the protocol. And I think that is why Rishi Sunak has done so, in terms of constantly talking about what the communities think rather than what Tory MPs do. But I think the timing of the vote today is notable.
And Boris Johnson is doing it to make a point of difference and to see how many numbers he's got.
Well, while we're on Boris Johnson, let me just remind you of this story back in the autumn of 2019, quite near the start of Boris Johnson's time as Prime Minister. It says here in the HuffPost, 21 Tory rebels rebels sacked by Boris Johnson for voting to block a no-deal Brexit. They were rebels who were sacked by him at the time, including two former chancellors, Ken Clarke and Philip Hammond, and Nicholas Soames, Winston Churchill's grandson. Andrea, Boris Johnson is rebelling against the Prime Minister today. Should he be able to remain as a Conservative MP?
I think the scenario then was very different. You'll remember we were in a hung parliament. We were literally held prisoner by the fact that we were a hung parliament, and the people had voted to deliver Brexit and the parliamentarians were unable to do so. So it was a very legitimate decision to say if you vote against the government's determination to get Brexit done at all costs, you will have the whip removed.
All right, so
today is not the same issue as that.
All right, let's talk about this afternoon's political theatre. It will be obviously very important in terms of the issues being discussed too. But this is Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister, being in front of a committee of MPs, the Privileges Committee. Now, we know that rules were broken by parties and gatherings at Downing Street because Boris Johnson was fined by the police, and the Sue Gray report into it also concluded that rules had been broken. We know Parliament was misled because Boris Johnson has said so, but he's apologised and corrected the record. He also says that he honestly believed that at the time no rules were broken and that the committee has no evidence to prove he knew otherwise. Let's take a look at some of the front pages. The Guardian. Johnson faces fight for political survival at Partygate hearing. This is the Mirror with their front page. Boris's Partygate excuses. I'll read a few. It was my birthday and I didn't even get cake. There was a party, but I was tucked up in bed. Dominic, as in Dominic Cummings, made it all up. He hates me. And so it goes on. And then finally, the Mail has this as their front page. Bullish, Boris up for the fight. Let's welcome David Campbell-Bannerman. He is the chairman of the Conservative Democratic Organisation and very much a supporter of Boris Johnson. Before we come to you, David, I'm just going to remind our audience and our guests of what Boris Johnson said to MPs during that time.
Will the Prime Minister tell the House whether there was a party in Downing Street on the 13th of November?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, no, but I'm sure that whatever happened, the guidance was followed and the rules were followed at all times. I have been repeatedly assured since these allegations emerged that there was no party and that no COVID rules were broken, and that is what I have been repeatedly assured.
I know, David, you can't actually see this, but I'm going to read it to you. This is evidence that's been released by the Privileges Committee this morning. We have Boris Johnson's dossier, his defence yesterday that was published, but this is new evidence that has been published today. We're just going to show this excerpt. It's from Martin Reynolds, the Principal Private Secretary to the Prime Minister, about what he said at Prime Minister's questions about all guidance being followed, and the Prime Minister saying he was reassured by guidance that he had received. But you can see here that Martin Reynolds said, well, I accepted this from the Prime Minister, but questioned whether it was realistic to argue that all guidance had been followed at all times, given the nature of the working environment in Number 10. How much does that damage Boris Johnson's case today, David?
Not at all, I think. I mean, Reynolds is one of those advisors that were meant to have advised Boris Johnson properly. And I think, you know, the whole Boris defence relies on the fact he was badly advised, effectively. You know, he actually genuinely believed what he was told by these advisors, that there were no parties as such. And he didn't intentionally mislead Parliament. I think that is really, really key to this. If you intentionally lied and misled Parliament, that is very serious. But there's no evidence of that. As he points out in his defence, 10 months they've had to find some evidence, 23 witnesses. And there's no evidence he recklessly or intentionally misled. And I think that is absolutely key to this.
Just before I go to the panel, I'm just going to read another excerpt from the evidence released by the Privileges Committee on the basis of what you've said, that you don't think, or you believe him, and you don't think he intentionally misled Parliament. It's an extract of messages between Number 10 official and Jack Doyle, who was heading up the communications. The redacted bits are not to identify the official. And it's in response to the Prime Minister attending a gathering for his birthday involving cake. or not. I'm trying to do some Q&A. It's not going well, says the official. Jack Doyle, I'm struggling to come up with a way this one is in the rules in my head. Jack Doyle says Prime Minister was eating his lunch, of course. The official, I meant for the police bit, but yeah, as ridiculous as the cake thing, it is difficult. Reasonably necessary for work purposes? Jack Doyle, not sure that one works, does it? Also blows another great gaping hole in the Prime Minister's account, doesn't it? That implies the Prime Minister did know what was going on and they were trying to find ways around the rules and guidance.
Well, this has been addressed in the defence, I believe, that, these were messages between advisers. It wasn't actually raised with the Prime Minister at all at the time, or Boris Johnson at the time. I mean, people, I worked in government as a special advisor on the Northern Ireland peace process, quite closely with Number 10. There are all these messages flying around. The point is, Boris wasn't aware of a lot of this, and he relied on his advisors. He was incredibly busy. He was just recovering from COVID, heaven's sake.
All right, well, let's ask the panel. I mean, is that credible, Andrea? You've just listened and seen these messages. Is it credible what David Campbell-Bannerman is actually saying, that he just didn't know? Although he set the rules, he agreed to the rules, we have pictures of him at these gatherings, that he just was oblivious.
I think this is incredibly difficult, and I think it is just not sensible for any of us to kind of sit here and analyse without seeing all of the wealth of evidence that the Privileges Committee has. They've been wading through this for 10 months. They've got so many witnesses, evidence and so on. So, I mean, I share the scepticism of everyone. How could you not know? But on the other hand, having been a Secretary of State myself, which is much less pressured than the PM, you are aware that a huge amount goes on that you're not privy to, where people are discussing things that you're doing or
going on.
Well, I agree. It is in hindsight, but it's not clear at the time that in a working environment that it just isn't clear. That's why I just go back to the fact that we have to let the Privileges Committee do their job.
So you believe Boris Johnson when he says he genuinely thought all the guidance and all rules were followed at all times and it wasn't obvious to him?
I'm not saying I do not have a personal analysis with the benefit of the 10 months and pages of evidence that the Privileges Committee has.
I mean, this is personal for me. He has brought my profession, my place of work into disrepute, and in any other workplace, that's gross misconduct. And to say that it wasn't intentional, this was premeditated. He had conversations, he read a speech out, someone typed that out saying there wasn't a party. He knew there was a party. It's been proved there was a party. The police have proved there's a party. He's admitted there's a party. It was intentional. Whether or not the committee will be able to get an agreement on that is a different thing, but the public know.
David, you're shaking your head.
No, I mean, you talk about misconduct there, Sarah. It's not the same as
gross misconduct.
Well, gross misconduct. It's not the same as recklessly misleading. Or
I said intentional.
I think that's a false or unhelpful comparison, to be honest.
Well, that doesn't surprise me because you're backing Boris Johnson on this and you're not looking at the evidence that's just been presented to you.
Backing fairness and Parliament, because if this goes through, every minister, and you intend to be a minister, presumably, will not be able to tell the truth in Parliament. They will not be able to actually form fear of being thrown out for intentionally or unintentionally misleading Parliament. It will close down Parliament and the committees and anyone appearing at those committees. It would be a disaster.
I think there's a very big difference between misleading or...
Sorry, I think there's a slight sort of sound disconnect there. Try and let David Campbell-Bannerman finish his sentence. But anyway, Sarah, you respond, just because he drops out.
Well, I just think that there's a very big difference between misleading Parliament and, maybe for security reasons you don't give all of the evidence, or maybe you just don't know the answers. And to be quite honest, I think we ought to be truthful. And I think there ought to be a very hard line that we do tell the truth and we do get called out. Politicians are probably the lowest of the low in the public's opinion, and things like this just drags us down even lower than that. That's not what I want to be seen as. I want to be seen as someone that's truthful, and that's why this is personal to me, and he needs to be held to account for it.
And can I just say, I totally agree with Sarah on that. Likewise, I think I deeply regret the way that politicians are viewed. I think it's vital that we're honest. I think getting to the bottom of this is absolutely essential, not least of which for all of those constituents who weren't able to attend funerals or weddings and so on. It's absolutely appalling, and so we have to get to the bottom of this.
Jess?
I do think that we've seen a significant amount of the evidence now that's going to be presented to Boris Johnson.
And how damaging?
We've been all going through that dossier this morning, many political journalists here, and much of what he relies on is that he is badly advised. And what we've seen in the dossier this morning, and I expect what they'll rely on later, is that several of those advisors, including Simon Case and Jack Doyle, his Director of Communications, say that there were specific things that they do not recall him saying, that them advising him not to say. So particularly, Jack Doyle says it's hard to say that we could comprehensively say that social distancing guidelines was followed at all times, and yet that's the kind of thing that Boris Johnson strongly intimated in the House of Commons.
Katie?
I mean, I think the evidence looks difficult for Boris Johnson. And I think there's then the question of, and we expect this to drag on for weeks and months.
Yes, because they're not going to make a decision, are they, this afternoon, the Privileges Committee?
Exactly.
They'll hear evidence which could go on for several hours. Sorry.
So he could be found guilty of intentionally or recklessly, depending on whether he's misleading the House. It doesn't mean he's necessarily suspended for 10 days. We will talk about this worst-case scenario for Boris Johnson, which is the 10-day suspension, which could leave him vulnerable to a recall petition and then could lead to a by-election. But I think there's a question here about politically, what does that mean for the Tory party? There's a really interesting Con Home Tory activist poll this week. Quite a lot of sympathy amongst the grassroots for Boris Johnson in terms of, we've seen all these claims from Boris Johnson supporters about the political nature of this. And there's sympathy in the grassroots, but and this idea he should be allowed to remain as an MP. But when it comes to, would you like Boris Johnson to return to number 10? I think 2/3 are not supporting that. Right. But the longer this drags on, the more of a distraction is for Rishi Sunak.
Right. Would you agree with that, David Campbell-Bannerman? It's a distraction to the Conservative Prime Minister Rishi Sunak by his predecessor, Boris Johnson.
Well, sorry, Rishi Sunak was fined as well for exactly the same offence, so maybe he needs to have a few answers ready. No, I mean, there is this huge vote today on the protocol. I was involved in the Northern Ireland peace process, 96, 97. And it's very, very key. And I think Boris has come in quite rightly to say we don't want to be tied to EU rules anymore. And I fear this does exactly that, as the backstop was trying to do and the Chequers deal was trying to do.
So you just want him back as leader, don't you, Boris Johnson?
Well, I personally would. It's not what CDO is about. We're actually about party reform and democratic reform. We're not anti-Rishi. But it was a scandal that, members said no to Rishi, and then 2 months later he was imposed by a group of MPs. And I'm afraid the MPs are the problem on this.
All right.
And they're very angry about it.
Well, let me put that. That's people, Conservative MPs like you, Andrea Leadsom.
I mean, I don't think that it was exactly as David says there. Obviously, he's not a UK parliamentarian any longer. The fact of the matter was that Boris Johnson resigned as Prime Minister, and then there was a contest, and then we all know what happened with Liz Truss's premiership, and then Rishi was indeed appointed. But the fact is that Rishi has made a fantastic start. He is tackling some of the big issues. He's focusing on halving inflation, on stopping the small boats, and he's focused on today tackling the remaining issues for Northern Ireland, and I think he is doing a very good job.
I mean, in terms of the Northern Ireland, the New Deal, we've just heard that the European Research Group of Conservative MPs, the chair, Mark Francois, a strong recommendation to vote against it. Katie Balls, perhaps no surprise, but again, the numbers will be adding up in terms of rebelling.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think this is surprising. If you looked at the report from the European Research Group yesterday, it was pretty damning. Specific quotes from Rishi Sunak and then saying why they thought he was wrong. That it was almost a question as to why they were leaving it another day. Maybe it was to stretch the period out that people were, paying close attention to the ERG. But I think, therefore, this isn't a shock. Let's look at the numbers. I mean, ultimately, does it get more to the working majority? That could suggest problems for Rishi Sunak in the future if you have a block of MPs against him on this piece of legislation. But to Andrea's point earlier, I mean, I think some of this can be political in terms of what Boris Johnson is doing, but some of these are concerns about the deal itself, so it's not a straight anti-Rishi vote.
I think absolutely key is a review point. I think, to me, the big problem, the big sort of question mark in my head is we signed up to the Northern Ireland Protocol. It didn't work. In my view, it's because the EU didn't help it to work. Now we have a new arrangement. We need to be given the chance, if that isn't working either, to be able to review it at some point in the future. All
right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you to you, David Campbell-Bannerman, for joining us. Just to remind viewers, proceedings start at 2 o'clock this afternoon in Parliament, with Boris Johnson giving opening remarks, and also the Chair, Harriet Harman, the Labour MP, doing the same. They all have to break off about half an hour later because they have to come back to the chamber to vote on what we have been talking about, which is the new Brexit deal for Northern Ireland being introduced and proposed by the government. But that is all happening in a few hours' time. Let's talk about something else, because last year a BBC investigation revealed that 9 in 10 NHS dental practices across the UK are not accepting new adult patients for treatment under the National Health Service, and 8 in 10 NHS practices are not taking on children. The dental shortage crisis isn't improving. Let's take a look at this headline in the Mirror. Over 70 children a day having rotten teeth out in hospital amid NHS dentist shortage. Let's talk to Pete Williams. He's in West Sussex. He has issues finding an NHS dentist. Tell us about your experience, Pete.
Good morning, Joe. Firstly, the statement that you've just made about dentists taking on new NHS patients. I mean, even that's not correct. To be fair, I was at my current dentist's for over 13 years, and as soon as COVID finished, and we were able to get back to going to dentists, we immediately had a letter from our dentist saying that they were no longer treating NHS patients at all. Oh,
so you were let off altogether?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we were given a choice as to which type of dental plan that you'd like to take out and how much it would cost, or find another dentist.
And what did you do?
Well, that was over 2 years ago. It's now been 3 years since we've had any form of dental checks. I think. May I ask you and your panel a quick question, Joe?
Yeah, what is it?
The question is, and if each of your panel could just answer this question for me, just with a simple.
She's the gaffer.
Let's see what the question is.
Okay,
go on, spit it out.
So the question. It's very simple. So I just need a private or NHS answer from each of your panel and yourself.
All right. I'll put a general.
NHS or
yeah,
private?
no, I understand. We'll come to that in just a moment. But Andrea, how has the situation got that bad? And yes, do you use an NHS dentist or a private dentist?
I now use a private dentist. Because I can't get an NHS dentist in my constituency. So many people have issues with getting an NHS dentist. And actually, I did look up where exactly are we on dentistry, and I do know that the government has now changed the sort of payment for dentists of taking on NHS patients, and that's really important. So now dentists get paid for per filling rather than one payment regardless of how many fillings they do. So to make it worthwhile for dentists, that's important. I also see that the number of dental assessments last year from the NHS dentists was double that of the year before. So I think that's a good sign. I think all MPs are incredibly aware that this is a big problem.
But it's in a dire situation, isn't it? If not only can you not get onto an NHS list, but you're being let go in some cases in the way that Pete has said. What about you, Sarah?
Same situation as Pete. So I was with an NHS dentist and I got a letter telling me that they were going private. I couldn't find an NHS one anywhere else. I'm uncomfortable with sort of the paying by tooth. because I remember in my teens they wanted to give me 8 fillings and I refused, and I've got perfect teeth. I have no fillings whatsoever. So what we need is a proper reform of dentistry, and I've just done a big survey of my constituents. We had over 700 reply to it, and almost 40% of them weren't registered with a dentist, and half of those had desperately tried to get registered with a dentist. And it's as bad as an adult or a child, and that's a really big problem, particularly for children, because if we don't have the preventative stuff at early stages, that's when we see children turning up at the hospital.
Actually, I'd just like to say, with the Family Hubs and Start for Life project that I'm chairing on behalf of the government, we're rolling out family hubs across the country for families with pregnancy right the way through to 19 or 25 where there's disabilities.
And will that include
a core
dentistry?
part of it. Well, it's not just dentistry, is it? Because you don't have all your milk teeth taken out because you didn't see the dentist. You have your milk teeth taken out because your teeth are rotten. And that is all about helping families to understand the importance of brushing little gums and making sure that children are eating the right things and not eating too much fruit straight before bed. So there's all kinds of education that actually the family hubs, well, it is exactly Sure Starts.
But if I just give you an idea, though, of the cost, if I give you an idea of the cost, though, because you've both said you can't get NHS dentistry. I mean, if you look at the website, the Which comparison website, it says that a filling costs £65.20 at an NHS dentist. It can cost up to £250 at a private provider. There'll be many people like Pete who just can't afford or don't want to pay that much, and they are then sitting without checks.
Totally right. Yeah, I mean, I had a Ukrainian guest who needed a root canal. There was absolutely nothing. I mean, I basically had to pay for her. There was nothing that she could have recourse to.
But what you've been in government. You've been in government, and the Conservatives have been in government since 2010, and this is now in a crisis.
And I've just given you some statistics where I looked up, because absolutely we're in government, but the fact of the matter is during COVID lockdown hardly any dentists saw patients at all, and since COVID lockdown the number of dental treatments has surged. The government's investing significant sums in NHS dentistry and changing the payment system.
I'll go back to Pete and find out if he's reassured to hear that. But first of all, is this going to be a big political issue? I'm not going to ask you about your dental arrangements, but is this a big political issue?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that one of the things this contributes towards is this growing sense from people that the country just isn't working. They can't book a train ticket, they can't get a GP appointment, they can't find, they're being thrown off their NHS dentist, and it just feels like the crumbling of the state. And I think that is whether that is that perception, there may be ways which it's inaccurate and be different in different areas of the country, but there is a growing sense of it, and you see it coming through in polls, in focus groups all the time.
Right, would Labour do what Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, has suggested for GPs, and try and bring all dentists, because they're set up in a similar way, into the NHS?
It is a good question, and I don't have an answer, but I've tried to find an answer. I mean, the problem is on the ground that dentists are small businesses, and Andrew is absolutely right. During COVID, they were hit so badly, and many of them couldn't get any of the loans and grants. So, they're trying to make a living. They're a precious resource. Personally, I absolutely think that we ought to have a national dentistry service. It is part of our health and well-being.
All right, Pete, what do you think of what you've heard so far?
I think for the vast majority of normal working people, nothing that I've heard is going to help them at all. Going forward, dentistry now for enormous amounts of people is purely and simply a luxury, and for many people it's a luxury that they just can't afford. And again, going forward, more importantly, I think it's okay. I think for Angela to say that people should. Andrea, for people to say that they should look after their children's teeth, which of course they should do. But at the same time, going forward, this really is a ticking time bomb for children's oral health. And, I personally can't see myself getting an NHS dentist. And I've phoned over 40 dentists.
Right. And what about, and have you got teenage children?
We're a family of 2 adults and 2 children in full-time education, indeed. And in fact, my partner has joint custody with the children. Their father lives about 10 miles away. He's also tried to get the children into his NHS dentist, and they won't have it there either.
All right, well, Sarah, you wanted to say
yeah,
something.
I mean, one thing that they do in Europe is they have dental buses that go around to schools, and it's sort of part of a service that all children can get. I know that there are some charities happening, particularly in the north of England, where the children cannot get NHS dentistry, where they're providing that service. I mean, that is something which we could do pretty much immediately, and we could make sure that every child has got that good start and have a little, you know, lesson in how to brush your teeth and go home. I mean, I remember at school, you go home with a toothbrush and some toothpaste.
That could certainly happen in family hubs.
All right, Katie?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just to Jess's point, when you think about the fact of all the problems with the NHS, this is just, you know, an additional problem when it comes to the health service that lots of people think, you know, you shouldn't have to think about how you get to them. It should be pretty easy. I was looking at one of the pieces on this in the iPaper and about the number of people who are now attempting dentistry procedures themselves.
You see them in the US, in US supermarkets.
And I mean, that was pretty uncomfortable reading. But the fact that that is actually quite a notable figure does just show you how bad the problem is going to get. And therefore, I think, you know, there's always a question in things like a national dentistry service sounds like a lovely idea for many reasons, but how practical and how quickly can you really deliver that? So what are the things that you can do in the short term, and in terms of, is it increasing labour supply? Lots of those things that perhaps might make the distance before you do something bigger to the system.
All right, I mean, it sounds pretty desperate, doesn't it, Jess?
Yeah, and it certainly does. And of course, there's all things about the workplace review that needs to be going on to the NHS. I'm not sure if that covers dentistry. It probably should do as well. It's about a channel of people coming into the profession.
Pete Williams, thank you very much for joining us today to talk about the problems with getting an NHS dentist, and obviously quite distressing to hear stories that people might be actually trying to do it. Please don't, even if you can't find an NHS dentist. We're just going to pause for a moment. Let's welcome viewers from the BBC News Channel. You're watching Politics Live. We have about 5 minutes until Prime Minister's questions with the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and the Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer. That, of course, will start a very busy afternoon in Parliament, because pretty well straight afterwards we can see the chamber there filling up. In fact, it is Steve Baker, the Northern Ireland Minister, at the dispatch box. It comes ahead of a debate and crunch vote on the new deal that has been proposed by Rishi Sunak's government for more free-flowing trade between Northern Ireland and the rest of Great Britain, and also a break on further or future EU regulation. Meanwhile, in another part of the Houses of Parliament, there is Boris Johnson, who will be giving evidence to the Privileges Committee about whether he deliberately misled Parliament over parties at Downing Street. That's going to kick off at 2. They'll all break off and come back and vote on the Northern Ireland deal, and then they'll all go back for what could possibly be up to 5 hours or so of evidence being given by Boris Johnson and the committee, the Privileges Committee. We won't know the results or the outcome or the verdict of that Privileges Committee probably for a few weeks or so while they digest it. But let's talk to the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason. Chris, how big a day is this?
Yeah, it's pretty big, isn't it, on the kind of Richter scale of political news days? I say that, though, but this time last week we were talking about a budget, weren't we, which was in the offing. So it's the second Wednesday in a row why Prime Minister's questions, that usual theatrical centrepiece of the Wednesday sitting, is kind of overshadowed by a bigger moment, or a couple of bigger moments, really, as you were saying, with the debate and vote on the Windsor framework, this tweak to the Brexit deal for Northern Ireland, as well as this sort of set-piece occasion involving Boris Johnson, which matters for 2 reasons. One, because of his future and his reputation, but actually there's a bigger reason than that, which is one of truth. And that central building block, if you like, of public debate, and whether or not MPs could believe what a former Prime Minister was saying when he was addressing them in the Commons, addressing those revelations surrounding Partygate. That's the crux of all of this, over and above his reputation and what it might mean for any political future he might harbour an ambition for.
And you're absolutely right, and very important to people watching. They want to hear what Boris Johnson has to say about the substance of the claims that have been made and what was going on at the time. Politically, how difficult is today for Rishi Sunak on both fronts?
Well, firstly, on the Boris Johnson thing, Boris Johnson has made a career out of being an attention snatcher, and that's precisely what he is doing today. There's a very good reason why we saw Rishi Sunak sit down with John Kay, our colleague over on BBC Breakfast, earlier this week, because that, from Downing Street's perspective, if you like, was something of a sweet spot where he could talk up what he sees as his successes of the last couple of weeks. That trip to San Diego to sign a defence deal with the United States and Australia, the deal with Ursula von der Leyen of the European Commission on this Northern Ireland Brexit deal, and talk up the budget of just a couple of days ago, before you had the crunching return of Boris Johnson, not only reminding people of all of those revelations that brought about his downfall, brought about Liz Truss as his successor, and brought about that cratering of the Conservatives' opinion poll ratings, but then also this moment, this vote on the Windsor Protocol, where we're seeing, or the Windsor Framework, where we're seeing Boris Johnson getting up from that evidence session in a couple of hours' time in the Grimmond room of the House of Commons, walk down the road and kick the Prime Minister in the goolies by voting against his attempted alternative to the Prime Minister's protocol deal for Northern Ireland. Oh, and Liz Truss also voting against it as well as various other noisy names on the Conservative backbenches.
Yes, the list does seem to be going up. We're going to see you, of course, and be talking to you after Prime Minister's questions. Thank you very much, Chris Mason. I mean, listening to all of that, Katie, will anything have materially changed by the end of today, do you think?
Well, I think we'll have a sense of the flavour in terms of the mood in the party towards both Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, actually, with the Windsor Framework vote. I think on Privileges Committee, let's see, but I suspect lots of people have already made up their mind either way when it comes to MPs in the Tory party and some of those watching at home too.
Where does that leave Sir Keir Starmer?
Well, I think that I think either way, today is likely to be a good day for the Labour Party because, you know, of all the the way it exposes all the divisions in the Tory party. I think Isaac Levido, who's the key election strategist, said that the narrow path for a Tory victory is through unity and discipline, and today's the biggest test of that.
Oh, well, I mean, what do you say in response to that, Andrea? Because it is difficult then to watch this. It is important, of course. Will you be watching all the proceedings this afternoon?
I will indeed, but I do think that it'll be interesting to see if Keir Starmer answers the question about his own pension. Labour having made a big deal over the budget of pension lifetime allowance being increased, and he indeed has his own piece of legislation, which is called the Keir Starmer pension statutory instrument, enabling him to have an uncapped pension from the time he was Director of Public Prosecution.
Well, since you've raised it, people might see it as a bit of a deflection, but since you've raised it, Sarah, just to explain to viewers, as you know, in the budget, the fallout actually from the announcement by Jeremy Hunt, this £1 billion bung, as Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, has called it, to people who are wealthy enough to put away tens of thousands of pounds into their pension pot. He's got rid of that lifetime allowance, and yet is there hypocrisy because he has a very unique, or had a very unique pension settlement, which was really for him as Director of Public Prosecutions?
Well, Andrea's thrown a delicious curveball, which I didn't know anything about this, but this is all we're seeing, curveballs, and the country needs stability.
All right, on that, I think we can go into the chamber for Prime Minister's questions.
This morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Joe Gideon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow is the National Day of Reflection, a Marie Curie-led initiative bringing together communities across the UK to remember family, friends, neighbours and colleagues we have lost. Will the Prime Minister join me in thanking Stoke City Council for supporting my call for a post-box to heaven in Carmountside Cemetery, and on the second anniversary of the tragic death of my constituent, 2-year-old Harper Lee Fanthorpe, who swallowed a button battery, will he thank her courageous mother, Stacey, for leading the campaign to raise awareness of the dangers of button batteries? And will he back my call for legislation to ensure greater product safety?
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course I join my honourable friend in thanking Stoke City Council. I'm very sorry to hear of Harper Lee's tragic case, and my thoughts are with her friends and family, and particularly her mother Stacey. And we are aware of the concerns about button batteries. The law is very clear that products available in the UK must be safe. The Office for Product and Safety Standards has published guidance on exactly this for manufacturers and is working with the Child Accident Prevention Trust to educate parents and childcare professionals on button baton safety.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today we remember the innocent lives lost 6 years ago in a terror attack on Westminster Bridge. Amongst those tragically killed was PC Keith Palmer, who sacrificed his life to protect others. Police officers up and down the country work tirelessly every day to keep us safe, and we thank them for that. But as we saw this week, those brave officers are being let down. Dame Louise Casey found institutional homophobia, misogyny and racism in the Metropolitan Police. I accept those findings in full. Does the Prime Minister?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I join with the honourable gentleman paying tribute to PC Palmer and indeed all the other police officers who have lost their lives serving and those who do so much to keep us safe. I was appalled, Mr. Speaker, to read the descriptions of the abhorrent cases of officers who have betrayed the public's trust and abused their powers. And let me be clear, it is and was unacceptable and should never have happened. We have taken a series of steps already, and the government will also now work with the Mayor and the Metropolitan Commissioner to ensure that culture, standards and behaviour all improve. At the heart of this matter are the people whose lives have been ruined by what has happened, and I know the whole House will agree with me that it is imperative that the Met works hard to regain the trust of the people it is privileged to serve.
Keir Starmer.
I take it from that answer that the Prime Minister does accept the Casey findings in full, including the institutional failures. Because nobody reading the Casey report can be left in any doubt about how serious this is, and doubt for a second that it's restricted to the Met. The report lays bare how those unfit to join the police are aided by patchwork vetting systems that leave the door open. If the government backed Labour's plan for proper mandatory national vetting, we could end the farce that sees different police recruitment standards in different forces. Will he back that plan so we can make speedy progress?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there's no need to back that plan because we're already taking action to tackle the issues that are raised in the Casey report. And it was actually 2 months ago. It was 2 months ago that I met with Dame Louise Casey and the Metropolitan Commissioner, and we introduced a series of measures. For instance, the College of Policing is currently updating the statutory code of practice for police officer vetting that all forces legally have to follow. All police forces are in the process of checking their officers against the Police National Database, and in weeks, Her Majesty's Independent Inspectorate will report back on their re-inspection of all forces' vetting procedures. Now, these steps, of course, won't undo the terrible damage that have been previously committed, but we owe this action and more to the victims and survivors to ensure that such tragedies never happen again.
Keir Starmer.
Well, the problem with the Prime Minister's answer is what he's referring to isn't mandatory. How can it possibly be right to have different standards for recruitment in different police forces? No wonder the Casey report criticised what she calls the government's hands-off attitude to policing over the last 13 years. But let's call it what it really is, sheer negligence. The report also exposes chronic failures by the police to deal with rape cases, with officers using, and I quote, overstuffed or broken fridges containing the rape kits of victims. On his watch, rape charges are 1.6%. Yet the government still hasn't backed Labour's plan to have proper, high-quality rape and serious sexual offences units in every police force. Why not?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what Louise Casey also says is that primary public accountability of the Met sits with the Mayor of London. She described that relationship between the Mayor and the Met as, in her words, dysfunctional. But when it comes... So I hope when he stands up, he will also confirm to the House that he will take up these matters with the Labour Mayor of London so that he plays his part. But Mr. Speaker, the way rape victims were treated by the criminal justice system wasn't good enough, and that's why the government published an ambitious rape review action plan. It's right that we've extended Operation Sorteria across all police forces in the country. We've tripled the number of independent sexual violence advisors. We've improved the process of collecting phone evidence and being cross-examined. And since 2010, we've quadrupled funding for victim support services. That is a Conservative government doing everything we can to support victims and tackle predators.
People are fed up to the back teeth with a government that never takes responsibility and just tries to blame everyone. They can shout if they're proud of the fact that over 98% of rapists are never put before. If they want to shout about that, that's their record. Let them shout about it. You should be ashamed of yourselves. The truth is simple. After 13 years of Tory government, crime is out of control and people are paying the price. Before Christmas, the BBC reported the shocking case of a woman in Armthorpe who'd been beaten with a baseball bat by burglars 3 years ago. Nobody had been charged with that burglary, and she couldn't sleep at night. Under their watch, tragically, that's not an unusual case. So can the Prime Minister tell us what's the charge rate for theft and burglary across the country?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, actually, since 2019, neighbourhood crime is down by 25%. But he asked rightly about what's happening with rape cases. So let me just tell him that we are on track to meet our target of doubling the number of rape cases that are reaching our courts. Since the Rape Review Action Plan was published, we've seen police referrals double. We've seen charges double, and last year there was a 65% increase in rape convictions. Yes. But importantly, we also changed the law to ensure that rapists would spend more time in prison. But what did his shadow policing minister say? Prison doesn't prevent crime. It tells you everything that you need to know about the Labour Party. You can't trust them to keep Britain safe.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister stands there and pretends that everything's fine. He is so totally out of touch. He needs to get out of Westminster, get out of Kensington, and Mr. Speaker, I don't mean...
It's a big day today in the House, and it's a very important day. We do want to make progress. Holding us up is not advantageous to any of us.
Mr. Speaker, he needs to get out of Westminster, get out of Kensington, and I don't mean to Malibu, to the streets of Britain. Go there and tell people it's all fine and see what reaction he gets. The answer he didn't want to give, although he knows it, is 4% of cases, 4% of burglary charges are charged, 96% of theft and burglary cases not even going before the courts. Burglars twice as likely to get away with it now as they were a decade ago. They should be ashamed of that record. And that cul-de-sac in Armthorpe has apparently seen 10 burglaries in 18 months, but only one of them has resulted in a prosecution. So rather than boasting and blaming others, why doesn't he tell the country when he's going to get the theft and burglary charge rate back to where it was before they wrecked policing?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, let me say North Yorkshire's a lot further away than North London.
Can I say, I'd like the lines as well, but I prefer to hear them rather than jeering. Come on, Prime Minister. Mister. Now then, we are going to make progress. Mr. Shelbrooke will be buying the teas in the tea room if we're not careful. Come on, Prime
Minister. There'll be Yorkshire teas, Mr. Speaker. But Mr. Speaker, since the Conservatives came into power, crime is down 50%, Mr. Speaker. Violent crime down 40%. Burglary, the Honourable Gentleman mentioned burglary down 56%. Why? Because we've recruited 20,000 more police officers. We've given them the powers to tackle crime, and we've kept serious offenders in prison for longer. All they've done is vote against greater protections for emergency workers. They've opposed tougher sentences for violent criminals, and they are failing to give the police the powers that they need. It's the same old Labour, soft on crime, soft on criminals.
The only criminal investigation he's ever been involved in is the one that found him guilty of breaking the law. I've prosecuted countless rapists. On the Prime Minister, I want tougher...
Hold on. I am determined to hear the questions, whether it's the Leader of the Opposition, the Prime Minister, so I can... Sorry? I think you've got your first customer for tea, Mr. Kurtz. We keep having this little problem. We'll have no more. No, then, just a moment. So please, let's get through and let's just show some respect to both people at dispatch boxes. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've prosecuted countless rapists and I support tougher sentences. But you have to catch the criminals first. And when 98% of rapists are not even being put before the court, that's a massive failure on the government. And if he wants to go to Armthorpe, which is in Yorkshire, why doesn't he go to that cul-de-sac when he gets out and about in Yorkshire and ask them about those 10 burglaries that haven't been prosecuted? The reality is, after 13 years of Tory government, they've done nothing on standards, neighbourhood policing has been shattered, and burglars and rapists walk the streets with impunity. It's the same every week from the Prime Minister, whether it's the cost of living crisis, crime running out of control, or the state of the NHS. Why is his answer always to tell this British people they've never had it so good?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me just address the issue the honourable gentleman raised, because I said at the time I respected the decision the police reached and I offered an unreserved apology. But for the avoidance of doubt, Mr. Speaker, at the moment that happened, there was a full investigation by a very senior civil servant. The findings of which confirmed that I had no advance knowledge about what had been planned, having arrived early for a meeting. But he doesn't need me to tell him that. He's probably spoken to the report's author much more frequently than I have.
Look, the Prime Minister needs to answer the question. He doesn't need you to... I don't think we need any more. Let's keep it that way. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're getting on. We're halving inflation by paying 50% of people's energy bills and freezing fuel duty. We're cutting...
And it's the same for this side. Mr. Gwynne, I don't need any more from the backbenches here either. Can I just say, let's come... Mr. Fabricant, not again. I'm just quite seriously... Today's a very big day, some important decisions are going to be taken. So please, I want to get this House moving on. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're also cutting NHS waiting lists by resolving pay disputes and getting doctors back to work. And, Mr. Speaker, we're stopping the boats with a new bill to tackle illegal migration. That's a Conservative government delivering on the people's priorities.
Holly Mumby-Croft. Holly Mumby-Croft.
Can I thank my honourable friend, the Prime Minister, for the efforts he has made to support the UK's steel industry? Can I tell him that we remain very concerned about job losses at British Steel in Scunthorpe? So will he today reassure my constituents in North Lincolnshire that we will never see the end of UK steelmaking under his watch?
Mr. Speaker, the UK steel industry can have no greater champion than my honourable friend. And I know that this must be a concerning time for British Steel employees, and we stand ready to work with her to support them. Now, she's right, industrial sectors, including steel, have been able to bid into competitive government funds worth £1 billion to help support them to cut emissions and become more energy efficient. And the government's recently announced British Industry Supercharger Fund can help boost competitiveness in UK's key energy-intensive industries, and I look forward to working with her to ensure a thriving steel industry in our United Kingdom.
Leader of the SNP, Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to begin by paying tribute to PC Palmer. who so tragically lost his life in defence of this Parliament and indeed what we all stand for, democracy. Mr Speaker, what worries the Prime Minister most about Brexit right now? Is it the likely 4% hit to UK productivity, or is it 3 former Tory leaders planning to vote down his deal this afternoon?
Oh, Mr Speaker, Mr Speaker, the Windsor framework represents.
Just to help the chamber, just help everybody. I understand it's true, Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the Windsor framework represents a good deal for the people and families and businesses of Northern Ireland. It restores the balance of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and ensures Northern Ireland's place in our precious union. But what I would say to him, I was more intrigued to see the words of his own party's president, who just this past week have described his own party as being, in their words, in a tremendous mess.
Stephen Flynn. Mr Speaker, the reality is that whilst Westminster is once again consumed by the damage being caused by Brexit, the public at home are facing the biggest fall in living standards ever, the highest tax burden since the end of the Second World War, and inflation at 10.4%. When are the Conservative Party, and indeed the Labour Party, going to realise that Brexit can't work?
Mr Speaker, the actions that this government is taking are ensuring that fully half of most families' energy bills are being supported by this government. We're also making sure that we're delivering for people with the cutting NHS waiting lists, and that's something that we're happy to work with the Scottish Government to learn and share best practice with them on. But we're also, Mr Speaker, delivering on the people's #1 priority, which is to stop the boats and end illegal migration.
Tom Bradwell.
Mr Speaker, the unemployment claimant rate has declined significantly over the last decade, but there are still vacancies to fill and specific groups to help. And on Monday, the Employment Minister and I visited Arnold Job Centre, where Kelsey and her team are welcoming local employers to speak directly to job seekers, and a dedicated 50-plus work coach is getting more from that bracket into work. So would my right honourable friend join me in congratulating the staff at Arnold and other job centres across the country on the proactive work that they're doing, and when time allows, would you come to visit Arnold Job Centre in person to see the great work they're doing?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend and join him in thanking all the staff at Arnold Job Centre for their hard work. I shall keep his kind invitation to visit in mind. He mentioned the over 50s, and he mentioned the over 50s, or as my right honourable friend the Chancellor described them, are more experienced workers, and he was right to focus on them, because together with the Work and Pension Secretary, we are putting in place a range of measures to help support them to return to and stay in the labour market, and that is something that not only will help us continue to bring inflation down, but will support those people to have healthy, productive, fulfilling lives.
Neil Hamby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The UK Government recently confirmed that Scotland generated and sent south 35 billion kilowatt hours of energy in 2021. That number will rise to 124 billion in less than 8 years' time. For this multi-billion-pound bounty, Scotland will see no revenue, no manufacturing or supply chain jobs. In our land of energy plenty, why should our people be cold and hungry and businesses failing as a result of his government's robbery? So what has the Prime Minister to say in defence of this naked exploitation of Scotland's people and its resources?
Mr Speaker, actually, this government is a strong supporter of Scotland's North Sea oil and gas industry. And actually, it's the economically illiterate policy of, I think, almost all opposition parties to prohibit any new exploration of fossil fuels in the North Sea, which would have us then pay billions of pounds to foreign energy companies and then ship that energy here with twice the carbon emissions. It is a completely absurd policy, Mr Speaker, that's bad for our security, it's bad for our economy, and that's why we're better off with the Conservatives in charge.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. The island has been getting a better deal in recent years, and I thank the Prime Minister for that, especially before he was a Prime Minister, when he was working with me in different roles when he was in government to make that happen, and I'm grateful. However, the island remains the only sizable island in the UK without a fixed link, separated from the mainland by sea, which does not receive a funding uplift to support local government services. And this injustice has been ongoing now for 50 years. And all the evidence, Mr. Speaker, shows that it costs more to provide local services on an island than on the mainland. Will the Prime Minister work with me and his ministers to overcome this injustice this year? Thank you.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his continued campaigning on behalf of his constituents. It was a pleasure to spend many happy childhood holidays on the island, and I enjoyed visiting him more recently there as well. The Isle of Wight Council will benefit from a 10% increase in their funding in cash terms for the next financial year, and have been awarded an additional £1 million in recognition of the unique circumstances of the island, as my honourable friend points out. But I will ensure that he does get a meeting with the Minister for Local Government to carry on the good work that he and I started, and make sure that his local constituents get the support that they need.
Rem Stringer.
Mr. Speaker, we now know from the Telegraph's lockdown files that during COVID, at the very heart of government, science wasn't being followed and rational discourse had been abandoned. This had dire consequences for children's education, mortality rates amongst the elderly, the economy and access to the health service. Lessons must be learnt, Mr. Speaker, but we can't wait 10 years for the independent inquiry to tell us what we should do next time when the inevitable epidemic arrives. Will the Prime Minister agree to a short-term focused inquiry that can give us recommendations so that we do better next time?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as with any public inquiry, the process and timing of the inquiry stages are for the independent chair to decide. As Baroness Hallett has previously set out, she intends to gather written evidence throughout this year, with public hearings also starting this year. They held a preliminary hearing in February which covered pandemic preparedness and resilience, and they've set out dates for preliminary hearings into core political and administrative decision-making across the UK throughout this month. But most importantly, the honourable gentleman will recognise it is an independent inquiry, and it's for the independent chair to set the terms.
Jerome Mayor.
Mr. Speaker, more than 1.5 million people living outside London stand to be impacted by the Mayor's new London-wide ultra-low emission zone. Labour and the Liberal Democrats, they're all for the ULEZ charge. They don't care about the cost of living crisis. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that the best way to protect commuters and small businesses from the spread of this unfair £12.50 a day tax is to vote Conservative on May the 4th?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. And I think he also failed to mention that just this week we've seen Labour in Wales introduce more plans for further road charging as well, increasing cost pressures for public and businesses. And I'd urge the parties opposite to listen and stand up for the public and small businesses, just as the Conservatives do.
Hannah Bardell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. When my wee brother was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis 8 years ago, it's fair to say it turned our lives upside down. I'm incredibly proud of the man he is and all that he's achieved whilst living with this life-limiting condition. And my Livingston constituent, Stephen Sharp, manages local football team the Fulshay in Stonyburn. He has Crohn's disease and he lives with a stoma. And he's like many of our constituents up and down the UK, living with a life-limiting condition, trying to provide for their families whilst holding down jobs with a condition and disease that wreaks havoc on their body. So, Mr. Speaker, given 1 in 4 people wait more than a year for diagnosis, will the Prime Minister and indeed the House support the campaign to cut the crap and get diagnosed early for Crohn's and colitis? And would he meet with my constituent Stephen and I to look at what more can be done for awareness, research and funding? Yeah.
Can I thank the honourable lady for her question and pay tribute to, I think, her brother and also Stephen for everything that they're doing to raise awareness of this issue. I'd be very happy to meet with her and Stephen. It is something that I am familiar with, and it is a very difficult condition for people to live with, and it's right that they get the support and attention that they deserve, and I look forward to that discussion with her.
Sir Jeremy Wright.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Jamie Scott spent 4 weeks in a coma and remains seriously disabled as a result of a COVID vaccination. He and his family continue to believe that mass vaccination is the right policy, but it must also surely be right to ensure that that tiny minority who are seriously injured as a result are properly compensated. In the absence of court cases it's in no one's interest to litigate, the current limit on compensation is £120,000, even for very serious and lifelong injury, and anyone who is disabled by less than 60% gets nothing at all. That cannot be right. Will my right honourable friend look urgently at changing it?
Mr. Speaker, it is important to start by recognising the importance of vaccines in protecting us all, and not least the fantastic rollout of the COVID vaccines across the UK. But I am very sorry to hear about the case that my right honourable friend raises. In the extremely rare case of a potential injury from a vaccine covered by the scheme, a one-off payment can be awarded. This is not designed to be a compensation scheme, and it does not prevent the injured person in pursuing a legal compensation claim with the vaccine manufacturer. We are taking steps to reform vaccine damage payment schemes by modernising the operations and providing more timely outcomes. But of course, I'll be happy to talk to the honourable gentleman further about it.
Kurt Osborne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The new inflation stats this morning show food inflation is at 18%, the highest in 45 years. Millions are living in food and fuel poverty because of this government's failures and political decisions to enable grotesque profiteering at the expense of our communities. How on earth can the Prime Minister claim his plan is working, or is it in his eyes? Is it a success that so many people are struggling with their weekly food shop?
Mr. Speaker, the figures that have been recently published showed that since 2010, there are 2 million fewer people living in poverty, thanks to the actions of this and previous Conservative governments. Of course, no one wants to see people struggling with week-to-week bills like food, which is why it is so imperative we stick to our economic plan. And as the OBR have said, we are on track to halve inflation by the end of this year. That is the most important thing we can do to ease the burden on people. And in the meantime, we have a range of programmes, whether that's free school meals or indeed the holiday activities and food programme, to provide support to the most vulnerable families who need our help.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 60 million to improve transport links from Wednesbury to the rest of Black Country, 4 million for Wednesbury High Street, and last week, the most important part of the budget, the £22.5 million to level up Tipton Town Centre. Mr. Speaker, this government has put a vote of confidence in my communities, one they've not had for nearly 50 years. Can I ask my right honourable friend, delivery is going to be absolutely key on these projects, because can he ensure, using his good office, that we absolutely get this delivered on time and realise the potential of my communities in Tipton and Wednesbury?
Well, can I pay tribute to my honourable friend for his tireless campaigning on behalf of his local communities. I'm delighted that we are investing across the West Midlands, but particularly in places like Wednesbury and Tipton. And again, we will work with him to ensure that those investments are indeed delivered, working with the local councils, Transport for West Midlands and the West Midland Combined Authority. Those investments are going to transform people's lives and spread opportunity in his area, and he deserves enormous credit for making that happen.
Very grateful, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, households in Gateshead have seen their energy bills triple over the last 2 years. They've endured not just the energy unit price increase, but the daily electricity standing charges increase from an average of 22 pence in 2019 to 58 pence from next month, an increase of 155% in standing charges, over £200 per year. To many of my constituents, particularly those in low-income households, this seems like a company tax just for having the temerity to be connected to the network. And these schemes will continue long after energy support schemes have ended. So will the Prime Minister commit to ending the regressive increases in standing charges and instruct Ofgem to return them to 2019 levels, or even end them completely?
Mr. Speaker, thanks to the Chancellor, the government is providing support to a typical household energy bill, around half of that bill over the winter, support that was extended in the budget and will be worth £1,500 to a typical family. But we went further, Mr. Speaker, for those most vulnerable families. As the Chancellor announced, we will be ending the discrepancy between unit charges for those on prepayment meters, something that many in this House have called for, and also providing generous cost of living payments worth £900 to the most vulnerable families.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, two of my constituents, George and Carol Ellis, are my guests here in the gallery today. Sadly, in 2021, their son died by suicide. George was a member of the Yorkshire Regiment and had become depressed following one of his comrades who had taken his own life. In memory of George, Adrian and Carol have set up a support group which marries up one veteran with another who is able to talk through and hopefully help them. The support group is called Get Emotions Out, after George. Would the Prime Minister join me in offering condolences to Adrian and Carol and also his support for the work that they're now doing?
Can I join my honourable friend in sending my and the whole House's condolences to George's friends and family, and thank his parents for the brave work they are doing to raise awareness of veterans' mental health. Support is available for anyone experiencing suicidal thoughts, including from the Samaritans helpline. And thanks to the excellent work of my honourable friend, the Veterans Minister, we are working specifically to support veterans' mental health through Op Courage, which is a bespoke mental health and wellbeing service for veterans in the NHS, backed by considerable funding, which was increased in the recent budget, and that fully integrated service will be launched next month. But again, I pay tribute to George's parents for all the incredible work that they are doing.
Alison Thulis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Mariam Amiri, came to the UK from Afghanistan on a spousal visa back in 2016. The Home Office have just refused her renewal and advised she should return to Afghanistan. Mariam is an educator, due to start a university course in September. She's a valued community activist. She's a vocal opponent of the Taliban. She is married to a man who worked for British forces, and her family is currently being persecuted in Afghanistan. She's been trying to get them here since Afghanistan fell. Can the Prime Minister think of any barriers or hardships Mariam might face in returning to a country where there is not even any means of applying for a visa? And will he personally intervene, as the Immigration Minister is yet to reply to me, despite raising this 3 weeks ago?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, obviously it wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment on an individual's visa case, but I will ensure that the honourable lady gets a response from the Home Office with regard to that particular case.
Len Saxsmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Prime Minister to pay tribute to and congratulate my constituent, Max Woozy, best known as the boy in the tent, whose 3-year adventure camping outside is drawing to a close. To date, he has raised over £750,000 for the excellent North Devon Hospice, and will my right honourable friend wish everyone taking part in his final adventure, a camping festival at Broomhill Estate, great success.
Well, can I join my honourable friend in paying tribute to Max and everyone else taking part in this fantastic initiative, and congratulate them on raising such a considerable sum of money for a very worthy local cause, and I look forward to hearing how the rest of it goes, but very well done.
Final question, Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While the Treasury receives an additional £65 billion revenue from Scotland's oil and gas, they've only allocated £20 billion for carbon capture, but nothing for Scotland. They've cut the renewable energy budget by a third. They've only allocated £10 million for Scotland's world-leading tidal stream and failed to back pumped storage hydro. But yet they want us to contribute our share towards the £35 billion Sizewell C nuclear power station. Isn't it the case that within the Union, Scotland is the energy, but Westminster takes the powers?
Mr. Speaker, not only are we supporting Scotland's North Sea oil and gas industry, we're also providing £20 billion of funding for further carbon capture and storage, and does want to work and provide clarity for Acorn regarding their future path. But also, I think the honourable gentleman raised the issue of tidal power, and I am pleased to tell him that actually that is now included in the contracts for difference allocations, and there's 40 megawatts of new tidal stream power by 4 projects across Scotland and Wales in the last year. That's this government delivering energy security across the United Kingdom.
Complete questions.
That brings us to the end of a rather rowdy session of Prime Minister's questions, I have to say. It took Sir Lindsay Hoyle quite a lot of effort to keep everyone quiet so we could all hear the exchanges between the Leader of the Opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, and the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. It may have something to do with the fact that it is going to be a very busy afternoon in Parliament, because in about 20 minutes' time or so, that debate on the Prime Minister's, the government's new deal for Northern Ireland will kick off, and there will be a vote. We already know that former leaders and prime ministers, Conservative ones, are lining up to vote against it, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But let me introduce our guests for this part of Politics Live. For the government, Graham Stewart, Energy Security and Net Zero Minister, and for Labour, Sarah Jones, the Shadow Policing Minister, and of course, I'm delighted to say, the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason, is here. We'll talk about the substance of Keir Starmer's questions, which were in response to the Louise Casey report into policing standards and culture at the Met, and then the government's record on crime. But what did you make generally of the sort of mood at PMQs?
Well, Wednesday lunchtime and PMQs always has that kind of, if you like, tribal spirit about it, doesn't it? With backbenchers on all sides, letting off a bit of steam and a bit of noise and a bit of atmosphere in the chamber. But it did seem to have a bit of extra sort of vim and vigour to it today. Perhaps, as you say, because of the significance of the day, really. Both the debate that's about to come on this whole idea of the Windsor framework and the noises off we've heard from big voices this morning, and then, of course, the theatre around Boris Johnson and that committee hearing that he'll be attending in, 1 hour and 20 minutes' time. And all of those questions that swirl around Boris Johnson, a huge personality, obviously divides opinion, and his future, but then also those bigger questions that the committee is seeking to explore around truth, bluntly, about whether a former Prime Minister, lied to his colleagues in the House of Commons. That's the central charge that's being examined here. Mr Johnson vehemently denies that and says, well, he did mislead the House, it was unintentional. But that's why this matters, because that's an examination of that, if you like, Parliament seeking to hold to account a former Prime Minister. And I think because of the kind of circus that always follows Boris Johnson around, that creates a certain energy when he's known to be in the building and in front of the cameras in a much anticipated event.
Well, let's just start with that then. Graham Stewart, from what you've seen and heard, do you think Boris Johnson intentionally misled Parliament?
Well, I think it's not for me as a government minister to pronounce on this matter. My experience of Boris Johnson is that he is an honest and straightforward person, but we will see what this inquiry finds, and that's due process, and that's what should happen.
If he is found to have intentionally misled Parliament, should Boris Johnson lose his seat?
Well, that will again be up to others. I hate to keep passing it, but obviously it's up to the House authorities. It'll be up to the House overall. And again, as a government minister, we recognise that it's for the House to make these
So you're
decisions.
keeping your own personal views on this to yourself, because you obviously will have a view, because there's been so much material out there, and we all know what the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister, I should say, has said in the House. And we know there were parties, we know rules were broken, and we know he misled Parliament because he said as much, just not intentionally. Is there anything that might change your mind?
I haven't told you what my view is.
But have you made up your mind?
Well, no. I'm interested to see what the inquiry finds, and obviously they're looking over that, and they will make the decision, and we should all wait for that to happen, and then consider it once that has been produced.
And will you do the same? Wait for due process, as Graham Stewart has called it. Wait for the Privileges Committee to question Boris Johnson this afternoon before you make a judgment.
Absolutely, I will, but it's just one thing after another, isn't it? With this government, they've lost control of their own backbenchers this afternoon, they've lost control of crime, they've lost control of the economy. Now we're all having to relive the horror show that is Boris Johnson, and ministers are back having to dance on a pin about what he did or didn't do and what he did or didn't say. But it's for the committee, which is it is so important we respect the committee to do their work. We'll see what happens, and in a few weeks' time, as I understand it, we'll get whatever their judgment is.
Do you think it was a mistake for Labour Labour to keep Harriet Harman, the Labour MP, senior Labour MP, to chair this committee after she'd already made it clear she did believe Boris Johnson intentionally misled the House. She prejudged the outcome, if you like.
No, it's a majority Conservative committee, so they will make up their mind on that basis. So I think that's fair enough. And Chris Bryant, of course, stepped back from the chair role himself. You know, this is a House business. It is an independent process for that committee to come up with their view. Usually then it's a free vote in terms of how that works. Obviously, the government chose...
Well, it's going to be.
Yes, I mean, the government chose not to do it with Owen Paterson, so we'll see if they try and do the same this time. But we need to let that process take its course.
There will be a free vote, won't there?
I mean, we've got this tremendous breakthrough led by the Prime Minister in Northern Ireland. We've had the IPCC report on the whole future of the planet. And really? Are we talking about this standard investigation? I really do think we should be focusing on what's most important. I think one of the reasons there was so much atmosphere in the chamber is because on the Conservative backbenches, what they want to see is a government that is getting on and doing things. And there are, you know, this Northern Ireland issue, which I was temporarily responsible in the summer. I don't think anybody imagined that we could get the kind of breakthrough which Rishi Sunak has delivered. And it's on issues of substance like that I think we need to move the public conversation.
Is substance, to be fair.
We'll find out when it comes to a conclusion that will be noteworthy. Right now, I think there are other things we should be focused on.
It sounds, Graham, like the government's irritated that Boris Johnson is hogging the limelight again.
Well, I'm interested as a government minister on focusing on energy costs, on transforming our energy system, on making sure that we meet net zero, that we increase jobs and prosperity, and we tackle this appalling situation in the Met, which is unacceptable.
Absolutely. Well, now you've mentioned that rather helpfully, and of course, Sarah Jones is the Shadow Policing Minister. Keir Starmer started by asking the Prime Minister a question around the findings of Louise Casey, who carried out this extensive, damning, shocking report, which the Prime Minister said was appalling. Does the government accept Louise Casey's findings and recommendations in full?
I'm not. I don't think the government has come out with a formal response to it yet, so forgive me for that. But the findings are damning, are they not? And shocking, exactly as you say. And what we've got to do is make sure that that sort of behaviour is rooted out. It's totally unacceptable. And the government, the Prime Minister himself, has played a role in that. But it's, you know, I don't know how he does it, but the Police and Crime Commissioner for London is the Mayor of London. The primary political person responsible here is the Mayor of London. And it's like he's always missing in action whenever there's something serious coming on. The one thread we've got new head of the Met, you've got Home Secretaries changing.
He did call the review.
The one thread running through this is Sadiq Khan. Well, and I think, I hope Sadiq will work with the government, because the government is very serious about tackling this. I'd like to see the same seriousness from Sadiq Khan. And perhaps Sarah will be able to comment on that.
Have you read the report?
I haven't, no.
No. Well, the report goes into many different issues. It talks about how austerity has essentially stripped the Met of neighbourhood policing, how we are not tackling violence against women and girls. There are lots of issues around culture and behaviour, which you referred to, but there is a whole lot more. And let's just step back for a minute. There is a serving officer in this report who says that rape is essentially legal. And that is because we are not catching those criminals at all. And that happens over 90%, across the country.
98%
and it is a
rape
dereliction of duty, of the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary to devolve responsibility entirely when there are things they could do. Labour would put specialist rape units in every police force. We would bring in fast-track rape courts to speed up the cases. We would give extra support for victims. And Keir Starmer is making a big speech about this tomorrow.
Okay.
The idea that the Conservative Party is the party of law and order is for the birds, and really it's Labour that has a plan now.
Right, well, we'll get
Prime Minister just wants to push the blame.
The Labour guy in charge of the London Met, and it's the London Met, which is, it has to be said, the best funded. If we talk about austerity, the best funded police force in the country. And the idea, it has higher funding per head.
And if you read the report,
gets more money.
Don't talk over.
It has more money, and to use that as an excuse for Sadiq's failure to run an effective police force.
All right. Well, you brought up
Sadiq
Khan, as did the Prime Minister. I mean, Sarah, he is the Labour Mayor of London. He has primary responsibility for the Metropolitan Police Force, the largest police police force. And in the report, Louise Casey says that the relationship between the Metropolitan Police and the Mayor of London is dysfunctional. How much of the blame should be put at Sadiq Khan's failure to deal with the shocking legacy of the Met Police?
Well, the first thing to say is that Sadiq set up the report in the first place. So for him to then...
But that was relatively recently.
...take the criticism for it when it was his suggestion in the first place. He wanted to see the extent of the issues. What the report says is it's very hard to actually force forces to do what they need to do, and this happens across the whole country because the Inspectorate doesn't have any actual powers to do it. The IOPC, the Independent Office, doesn't, and the Mayor doesn't.
He has got responsibility. He does have powers.
Of course, the Mayor is the Mayor of London, and he has responsibility for policing.
Right, yeah.
And he has said in his budget this year he is going to put 500 PCSOs back into the Met after the government cut 50% of them across the country. So the Mayor is doing what he can, but he has one hand tied behind his back because we have a government that will not intervene on crime. We have a charge rate which has gone down by 2/3 since 2015 across the country. Every single part of the country, the crime rate has plummeted across the board.
Let me bring...
And the government needs to act, as well as, of course, all our mayors and PCCs across the country.
So do you accept the criticism of the Mayor in the report?
I accept the report in its entirety, and it talks about the
criticism
relationship
of him. Well, that's a step forward. I think that should be credited.
But I also accept that the Mayor is doing what he can in terms of bringing in new PCSOs, in terms of...
clearly he isn't. He wouldn't have been described as a dysfunctional relationship with the head of the Met.
Let me bring
if you accept the report, you accept that he hasn't.
All right, let me
done
bring
the
in
right
Chris Mason. Listening to this argument about who's ultimately responsible, there are a few things going on here. Sarah is saying and blaming to some extent the austerity since 2010, and Graham Stewart is blaming the Labour Mayor. There's the party politics for you to some extent. This is a very, very serious report. It's lifted the lid on what has been going on and the culture at the Metropolitan Police. What do you think will change or happen now we've got this report and from what we heard from the Prime Minister?
Well, firstly, just picking on the exchange that we've just heard, yes, you hear an argument, don't you, about, you know, as Sarah's making the point about what you see as the legacy of a Conservative government, but then there is also, obviously, the devolved and complicated nature of governance within the UK in 2023, and therefore where political responsibility lies and the big questions that there are undoubtedly for the Mayor of London. What strikes me is we're beginning to see, I think, a political battleground opening up around the whole question of crime. Yes, crime and the most serious of crimes, as we saw fleshed out in that report yesterday, but also day-to-day antisocial behaviour, huge scourge for so many people, which I think I detect speaking to people privately within the government, within the Labour Party and others, comes up so often, whether it's on the doorstep or in focus groups, as an issue that perhaps, because of the noise of politics in the last 6-7 years, confronting some of the huge questions, whether it be the pandemic or Brexit, perhaps there hasn't been that focus on the kind of pavement politics stuff around antisocial behaviour. And the government will be coming forward, I think, relatively soon with ideas in this space. Labour have been talking about it too. So yes, huge questions, institutional questions about some of our biggest institutions, whether it's the Metropolitan Police or other police forces around the country, which politicians will always have a responsibility to grapple with. But then also those inevitable questions that come in the direction of those in power or aspiring to be in power about what they'll do to improve the lives of our viewers day to day as far as their experience of crime is concerned.
You mentioned that perhaps those issues have been crowded out to some extent by Brexit, which has sucked up so much of the oxygen at Westminster. Let's just return to it because that debate and vote is going to be happening this afternoon. It's extremely important too in terms of power sharing, any chance of power sharing being restored at Stormont. But this is what the leader at Westminster of the Democratic Unionist Party, Geoffrey Donaldson, has tweeted in the last few moments. I have consistently indicated that fundamental problems remain, notwithstanding progress made. He's talking about the Windsor Framework, what the government is proposing to improve on the protocol. Consequently, there is not a sustainable basis at this stage to enable us to restore Stormont. We will vote against the proposal today, we knew that, and continue to engage with the government to secure clarification, reworking and change. Our consultation also continues and we are giving people and businesses the opportunity to have their voice heard. What's your reaction, Graham Stewart? They're voting against it and there's no chance of restoring power sharing.
Because we want to see power sharing restored. I mean, the Windsor Agreement has been a huge breakthrough. I was temporarily in the summer the Europe Minister and had responsibility in this area. And I don't think any of us, though we were all working hard across with the EU, with member states, to try and find a way forward, as well as with the Irish government and those in Northern Ireland. I mean, the Prime Minister it's a remarkable achievement.
Except they're not backing.
It does make a huge difference in terms of making sure that there aren't the trade barriers, that it reinforces the place of Northern Ireland in the Union. It is disappointing that the DUP are taking the position that they are. But I think across the Conservative Party there's a recognition that this is a significant improvement. People like David Davis, who will always speak as he sees, as he finds, coming out strongly and recognising the advances this has brought
three previous Conservative leaders, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Ian Duncan-Smith, Priti Patel, we're being told, as a former Home Secretary, all saying they can't vote for this after the Democratic Unionist Party have said that they will not back it. And you're just disappointed?
Yes, well, clearly it is disappointing that is the case, but it's what a difficult issue, as it has been. It's bedevilled our relationship with the EU. It comes up in every kind of area.
So what are you going to do? How are you going to get Jeffrey Donaldson and others on board? Will you change the Windsor framework?
Well, we have been working closely with them throughout and seeking to ensure that we can get them over the line and accept it. But there's, of course, a balance to be struck, and I think the Prime Minister has, as I said, brought forward a remarkably good deal. And we will see as it develop and seek to get the maximum support for it possible. Because I think
Labour, of course, is backing it, and I'll come to you in just a moment. Should any sanctions be brought to bear on Conservative MPs who rebel on, as you have described, this central piece of policy, this central plan to getting post-Brexit trading relations back on a stable footing? Should Boris Johnson and others have the whip taken away, as he did, in fact, to those Conservative MPs who wouldn't back his no-deal Brexit?
Well, I was once a whip, but I've never been the chief whip, so you'll understand me ducking that decision as to whether that's appropriate or not.
Do you think action should be taken?
It's terribly important. It's a tremendous achievement by the Prime Minister. I think it makes the most important thing it does is it puts so much more power back in the hands of people in Northern Ireland. That's what this is about. It's about peace in Northern Ireland.
If power sharing's restored.
Absolutely, we need to see that happen, and that's what I was arguing with my Irish and EU colleagues, that the dialogue, the protocol did not deliver what it said on the face of it. It was trying to deliver. And this deal goes so much further. But obviously it is a compromise. It's I think, rather brilliant compromise, but you were never going to have...
Well, it hasn't persuaded some notable people in your party. It has persuaded Labour. But are you comfortable, Sarah, with the idea that it's not backed by the Democratic Unionist Party, that you're supporting something that is being rejected by one of the communities in Northern Ireland?
Well, I worked for Mo Mowlam many moons ago in the run-up to the Good Friday Agreement, and what you learnt from that process was how important it is to talk to all the parties in Northern Ireland all the time and to take them with you. And I think all of the promises that were made about the protocol that were then broken means that we have difficult relationships that we have to build up again. Now, Labour's backing the Prime Minister on this because he can't get his own side to do it. Shows how split they are. But I think it's the responsible thing at this point to say this is better than the previous deal. It's not perfect, and the Prime Minister shouldn't pretend it's perfect. He needs to go and talk to the DUP and all the parties to make sure we're moving in the right direction, because there is nothing more important than trying to get that Parliament back, Assembly back working again in Northern Ireland.
Polling shows great support in Northern Ireland, including more unionists in favour than those are against. And I think that just shows the scale of the progress that the Prime Minister has made.
I just want to draw attention because Andrea Leadsom, who was sat where Graham Stewart was before Prime Minister's Questions, brought up this issue. I said we would return to it. If I just show you this headline in the Daily Telegraph, it says, "Hypocrite Starmer to avoid tax on pension." Perhaps you could explain this to us.
Yeah, so after the budget last week, there was a bit of a brouhaha, wasn't there, about this government idea to encourage senior doctors in particular to stick around in the NHS or do longer hours, because their previous pension arrangements, if they had a big pension pot, might mean it basically wasn't financially rational for them to carry on. And the fear was that you're losing brilliant cancer surgeons or whoever to the golf course because there's no point in them carrying on working. So they changed the amount that people could save per year into a pension pot without being taxed, and indeed lifted the limit on how big that pot could be. Row begins. Labour say it's a mistake because you're throwing money in the direction of people who are already very rich. But enter this Telegraph headline. It turns out that Keir Starmer, former Director of Public Prosecutions, had a particular pension arrangement. In fact, a pension arrangement set down in law that actually named him. It was specific to him at the time as the DPP, as that title is shortened to. Now, it was set up by a Conservative-led government. So it was during the coalition years, but obviously it allows Labour's critics to throw this label hypocrite around his neck, and Labour don't dispute the facts at the core of this Daily Telegraph.
So it's one rule. It's one rule for Keir Starmer and another for everyone else.
Well, look, the budget was an opportunity to do far more than the government did in terms of supporting working people. They made a decision, having previously said it was unaffordable to do for the NHS. They made a decision to allow this spending.
He does look like a hypocrite on this double standard.
This, as I understand it, is something that was introduced not by him but by the Conservative government. So it is a historical change that was made by the Conservative government.
How does it look, though, when Labour have said it was a £1 billion bung to the top 1%, the richest who can afford to have their lifetime allowance go up in terms of their pension? And here he is with a specific scheme doing exactly that, allowing him to put in as much as he likes.
So what Labour said last week is at a time of a cost of living crisis where we've got inflation through the roof and everybody is struggling, this is
senior
not
police
the thing
officers,
to do.
doctors and other people out of the workforce.
This was not the choice to make with the money that is available at the time. And we will set out what we are going to do economically when it comes to the next election. But at this point in time, we said that is the wrong way to spend money, the wrong way to help the British public who are really struggling.
The debate has started on the Windsor framework, or at least on the Stormont break of the Windsor framework. There in the Commons, if we can show you the pictures inside. Chris, your final thought really on today?
It's a big day. Boris Johnson at the centre of it. There'll be a moment this afternoon when he will get up out of his chair, giving evidence to the Privileges Committee, walk down the corridor and vote against Rishi Sunak. So, yeah, a big day for Boris Johnson, and that usually means a big day here.
We'll be back with more tomorrow from all of us. Bye-bye.
Oh, I just want to see Boris Johnson get grilled. Twat. Okay, just so you don't know what you do know. You got to the end of the show. I'll be back at about 5 to 2, so about 55 minutes from now. I'm not streaming the fucking debate, so don't ask me. Watch the news if you want to keep an eye on that shit. Depends what time it is, because he's going to be getting grilled for like 4 hours or some shit. So I don't know yet. Anywho, I'll be back in 55 minutes. It's not on BBC Parliament at all, but I did find it somewhere else, so that's good. Yeah, about 5, so I'll be back. I hope. Enjoy your rest of your 55 minutes, whatever you're going to do. Yeah, I'll see you then. Don't forget your popcorn, because this is going to be fun.